So in my career, I've worked in prisons, I've worked in courts, and I've worked in these secure units at different times. As a doctor, you have to separate yourself from that, and you have to give everyone the best chance of being reintegrating into society. And I just connected to mentally ill people. I think the delusions and the thoughts and the stories they have, some of which are not based in reality, are just fascinating. But further down the line, months after medication, she kind of came back alive, basically. She came out of the psychosis, and she reported retrospectively all these things that she was experiencing. So she told me that she was seeing like shapes of gods and angels in the clouds. She was seeing like shapes in the walls when she was in prison, and she was seeing shapes in the curtains while she was in the psychiatric unit. I want to have to word this carefully, but perversely that actually helps with his risk management, because it means that if he ever does get released in the future, he's far less risky, because you can't kill people with no harms, basically.
Oh, good grief.
Especially back in the 60s, I think he was hypersensitive to being publicly insulted. Plus, you throw in paranoid schizophrenia, which is what he was diagnosed with, which suggests to me that he was psychotic and he was unwell the whole time, because you don't have these psychotic symptoms, then they disappear and then they come back 2 years later. It's very unlikely. But I can understand why people, members of the public, just want to see this man punished. So I think that's why he was sent to prison, but he should have actually gone to hospital, in my view, from the beginning. He basically found his wife and this man in a pub. She went home and he followed her home, got a shotgun, and he shot her dead in front of their teenage son. He had another argument. He ended up strangling and killing this woman, then immediately tried to kill himself. So he ran out, like literally immediately afterwards, and jumped in front of a bus.
The world is racing to get back to normal. We all want to meet up again. But after a year of being locked down, it takes time to get back to normal. When we are going through things, we tend to turn to our friends to talk to, but they don't necessarily give us the best advice. We all need help from time to time, and asking for support is a sign of strength. It is not weak. Help is available immediately through Talkspace, who will match your needs with a licensed professional. You could get the help right away. Start feeling better with a single message. Match with a licensed therapist when you go to Talkspace.com, and you will get $100 off your first month if you use the promo code Shaun, SHAUN. That's $100 off when you use the promo code Shaun at Talkspace.com. Today we have a first on the channel, a prison forensic psychiatrist. And Sohom is the correct pronunciation of your name. And Sohom has his own YouTube channel. So I urge people to go over to A Psych for Sore Minds. The link to Sohom's YouTube channel and socials will be in the description box below this video. And the YouTube channel is doing quite nicely, seeing as though it's only been recently started. Sohom also has a book coming out. Am I allowed to say the title?
Absolutely.
We believe it is going to be called In Two Minds. So he has a lot of really hard-hitting stories about the various cases that he has had to deal with over his career. Some of them are particularly harrowing, but he's a good man trying to make positive changes in the system and influence the world in a good way, because we know from this channel how dark and negative the energy is in the prison system and how there's so much corruption, and it's designed just to bring people back in America so they are clients for life for the prison industries. So we were going to start out then talking about one of your cases whereby you said a child ended up getting killed. So what led to the point where that child was killed?
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you very much.
Oh yeah,
for
huge
having me
thanks for
on,
coming on. Yeah. And thanks for the snacks.
It's a pleasure. Everyone loves a donut.
Yeah.
So this case really sticks out in my memory. It was one of the most emotionally charged cases I've seen. And it's also one of the first cases where I gave evidence in court as an expert witness. So I was a middle grade psychiatrist, a registrar. And basically there was this young 18-year-old girl who had no previous issues. So no previous mental health issues, no offending. She didn't even get in trouble at school. She didn't even get detention. And then she just completely randomly out of the blue became psychotic. And she had all these delusional beliefs.
Was she on drugs or anything?
No, not as far as we know. No. And she believed that there was demons inside her nephew.
No.
She'd been acting a little bit oddly in the weeks coming up to that. So it's what we call a prodrome of psychosis. So it's not full-blown psychosis.
When you say oddly, what was she doing?
So she was, she stopped listening to her sort of Miley Cyrus pop music, and she would listen to this weird instrumental music. She would stare out the window for long periods of time. She would kind of chastise her own family for doing really weird stuff. So for example, she said that this sitcom that they used to sit down and watch together was smut, and used to turn the TV off in front of them. So her family were obviously concerned, and they tried to seek psychiatric
Who was
help.
she living with at that point?
So she came from quite a tight-knit family of immigrants. So it was her parents, her two brothers, I believe, and the son, her nephew, who she ended up killing. So she was just babysitting him, as she had many, many times before. She made a few odd remarks that morning. Everyone else left the house, and then basically she smothered and killed this child.
Oh my God, what did she use to smother?
A pillow, yeah. And then when the police...
How old was the child, you said?
I think she's coming on to 3.
Oh.
Yeah. So it was absolutely shocking. This is not the typical kind of case I've seen. This is one of the most extreme.
And what did after that then? What did the perpetrator do?
So she just went about her day, and then her mother came back. So the child's grandmother, and thought
she
the
went
child
about
was
a day as if
sleeping.
nothing had happened.
Yeah. Well, I think she was in her own little psychotic mind.
Yeah.
And then her mother thought that the child was asleep.
Oh my God.
Didn't realise for about half an hour when she tried to raise the child that he was actually dead. And then she was making comments about how she was going to reincarnate him, and you just have to believe. Then the police got called. She was saying the same kind of things. She obviously got arrested. Then she was remanded into prison, and it was actually quite hard to assess her because I then got the referral.
Yeah.
So I was working in a medium secure forensic female unit at the time, went to see her in prison, and she was really difficult to assess because she was so paranoid and psychotic that she wouldn't really let me into her psyche. So she was sort of superficially polite, but very dismissive. She would say things like, I can't remember when I asked her about what happened, and she would say, I've already told you that, doctor, or I don't see how that's relevant. So there was no way in to try and assess her.
So what was your approach then when you've got those barriers in front of you?
So when I have patients like that, you've got to be as non-threatening and as empathetic as you can be. So you don't ask them about what happened until the very end when you can slip it in. You just try and start a conversation with them. And more often than not, they kind of let you in eventually. But that didn't happen in this particular case. She just wouldn't engage me in any way. So I was convinced that she was psychotic. And luckily, the judge, I think, agreed. I think had it been a different set of circumstances, had she possibly been male or had she been antisocial with a history of offending, I think it would have been a harder sell. But the judge agreed to let me move her onto a remand section of the Mental Health Act.
Was the prosecutor pushing for something else?
Yeah. So that comes a bit further down the line. So we had her for a couple of months, and treating her in hospital was also a challenge because, again, she wouldn't engage with people. She wouldn't take medication. So then we had this dilemma. Do we force medication on her, like physically hold her down and inject her, which you can do under the Mental Health Act, or do you try and build a relationship? But because the remand section was relatively short, I think it was only 3 months, which is not a long time in psychiatric terms, we had to bite the bullet and inject her. And she started getting better within the first few weeks. I mean, she didn't fully resolve her psychosis until months later down the line after the court case. But as you say, so when it came to actually giving evidence in a trial, so that was the first time I'd given evidence, and it was at the Old Bailey, and it was a murder trial as well. So it was, I was really been thrown into the deep water. The prosecution were trying to get her in prison for life imprisonment. And I thought that was completely the wrong thing for this young woman. So I had to just extract all the psychiatric symptoms that I could. She made a few odd comments on the ward. So she would ask me about reincarnation. And then when I asked further questions about why she was asking, she would try and retract it all. So there were little glimpses of psychosis, but nothing overt and barn door. But we convinced the judge to put her on a hospital order, which means she goes to long-term rehabilitation. Yeah, so that's one of the reasons that it was so emotionally impactful, was the actual offence itself and the innocence of the perpetrator. But the other thing was that part of the therapy was with her trying to reconnect with her family. So I'd be sitting in a room with this young woman, her brother, who is the father of the murdered child, and trying to sort of piece together this sort of fractured relationship.
Oh my God.
Yeah.
So the brother then and the mum of the kid, what were their attitude towards the sister?
So I'd never actually met the mum. She was too upset to ever come in and visit.
Yeah.
I don't think she visited the entire time. I met the father of the child, that's her brother, and also her father, the perpetrator's father. I have to say she was quite lucky in a way, because they were very sort of open to understanding that she was unwell, and they were very helpful in terms of her rehabilitation.
Oh my God.
So for example, after she finally got discharged years later, they were happy to have her live in the same house, etc.
Wow.
That doesn't always happen with the patients that we see.
Wow.
So that one really sticks in my mind, definitely.
When she got on the medicine, then you said she started to come out of the psychosis. So in court, then by the time it was coming to court, was she behaving more normally?
No. At that point, she mentioned a few things that were quite bizarre. So I talked about reincarnation before. She would also be quite preoccupied with religion. So she asked me a question like something like, if a Muslim eats pork by accident, will they still go to hell? Like just completely randomly in the middle of a conversation. So she had these weird beliefs, but she wasn't. She was a bit reserved about it all. But to answer your question, no, in court, she didn't interact with anybody, didn't say anything. So we were quite lucky, I think, that the judge believed that she was psychotic. But further down the line, months after medication, she kind of came back alive, basically. She came out of the psychosis, and she reported retrospectively all these things that she was experiencing. So she told me that she was seeing like shapes of gods and angels in the clouds before the offence. She was seeing like shapes in the walls when she was in prison, and she was seeing shapes in the curtains while she was in the psychiatric unit. And then after all of that, she obviously, once the psychosis went, what she actually did and the consequence of her actions started seeping into her psyche. So another part of her treatment was just to help her get over this depression when she'd realised what she'd done. Yeah.
My goodness. When she realised what she had done, was she horrified then and showing remorse?
Absolutely. Yeah. But it was really difficult because she was so upset and she was just burst into tears that it's quite hard to, discuss and break down the mental processes behind her thoughts when she was so upset. Yeah, so it took a long time.
How long ago was this? Did the crime occur?
I think it was 2015, I think, yeah.
And has she been okay since then?
Unfortunately, I don't know that much because as a registrar, we move on every 6 months. So I was only involved with her care. It's different now that I'm a consultant.
Yeah.
So, but I happen to be quite pally with the team, so I do get updates on her every once in a while because obviously it's a case that I'm interested in. But yeah, she has been released. She's back with her family,
and she's still living with the family.
Yeah.
And what was the parents' attitude? Her own parents' attitude?
I think I never really got a handle of what her mum thought about it because she was just too upset to engage with us at all. I think the father and her brother were quite forgiving, actually. Yeah, I think they realised because it was just so inexplicable and random that they knew that she couldn't have had the intention, she couldn't have known what she was doing at the time. Yeah.
How long before the crime were the symptoms manifesting?
So I think this prodrome happened for about 3-4 weeks.
What does a prodrome
The prodrome is these weird, it's like the harbinger to psychosis.
Yeah.
So it wasn't full on overt psychosis, but it was just these odd comments and odd behavior. So for a few weeks. But I should also say that her case is very unusual. When for the vast majority of people, when psychosis comes on, it's a lot more obvious, a lot more overt. She was just quite an unusual case.
So people can live a completely normal life, and then the brain chemicals can change to the extent where this can happen. Yeah. Usually for most patients, there are risk factors. So usually there's some sort of family history of mental illness. In a lot of the patients I see, they've got other background issues like, poverty, homelessness, or they're victims of abuse. Those are most of the clientele that I see. So her case was exceptional. Wow. Did you ever come across any other cases comparable to that or similar?
Actually, yes. So quite recently, I assessed a mother who she got postnatal psychosis and she killed her own baby.
Oh my God.
I only did a one-off assessment. So I've only ever met her once for a court report. She didn't belong to me for the rehabilitation like the first young lady.
So in this case, then she actually gives birth, and the act of giving birth changes the brain chemicals, does it?
Absolutely, yeah.
And then the behaviour changes, and they go into full psychosis.
Yeah, so it's called postnatal psychosis or puerperal psychosis, and it happens in about 3 or 4 out of every 1,000 mothers. Usually it's different from most other psychoses in that it happens really quickly, but it tends to resolve quite quickly as well. So it lasts about 10 weeks. And unfortunately, antipsychotics take about 4 to 6 weeks before they start working. So it's actually really hard to treat, to catch it in time. So it's more about keeping the mother and the baby safe than trying to sort of chemically treat the illness. Yeah.
What measures are implemented to keep mother and baby safe? Do they have to be separated?
Sometimes, yeah. So you need a forensic psychiatrist like myself to do a risk assessment, because not everybody who has this kind of psychosis ends up with such risky behaviors. So you can't, it's not humane to just separate every mother from their baby. So you have to do a really thorough, regular risk assessment to really test the waters to see what their thoughts and their delusions are. And if there is risk, then you can separate them. Or having said that, there are mother and baby units. So this is a new area of forensic psychiatry that's growing. There's not that many of them in the country, where the mother and the baby are both kept together, but they're in a psychiatric hospital. And it's set up to help nurse a baby. So, there's equipment, nappies, there's like pediatric nurses, etc. But as I say, that's only a new kind of resource that's only started to grow recently. So the majority of women can't get into them because there's just not enough beds.
In this case, then, what were the symptoms that came before the crime?
So it was not too dissimilar to the first young lady, actually. So I should say that she's had children in the past from a separate marriage. I think there were roughly 6 and 8 years before I saw her. And she became psychotic both of those times, but she didn't hurt the children. She just did some other slightly bizarre things. I think she attacked her mother randomly once and picked up a table on another occasion. So she started having she was hearing the voice of an angel. So she was Muslim, and she was aware of the story of the angel Abraham, I think, who was asked to sacrifice a child. So she was hearing the voice of this angel saying that you have to sacrifice your child and that hell's about to come and the world's going to end. It was actually when the coronavirus was starting as well. So that kind of tied into everything. So she was convinced that she had to do it. Yeah.
So when these symptoms started to manifest, what was the diagnosis at that point?
Well, the problem was she wasn't assessed initially. So to be fair, I think that was to do with her actual life circumstances. So from what I can gather, she was in quite a difficult situation. She had quite an abusive husband who wouldn't really let her leave the house. She'd only been in the UK for less than 2 months. So she was from Turkey. So she had just come over. And so nobody knew what was going on. It was only after she did the deed, and then she phoned her husband straight away to tell him. Not in a kind of angry, hostile, threatening way. She just didn't know what was going on. So she phoned him, he phoned the police. But when I saw her, which is about 2 or 3 months later, she had gotten better with some antipsychotic treatment.
Did she take them voluntarily?
She did, yeah. But as we were saying before, postnatal psychosis tends to resolve fairly quickly anyway compared to other forms of psychosis. So I think she was already just naturally going to get better anyway. But yeah.
What happened in the court case?
So it's very similar to the first one. I made a suggestion of not guilty by reason of insanity, which the judge accepted. And she got a hospital order, which means hospital for long-term treatment instead of prison. And she got a restriction order as well. So these are reserved for the most high-risk patients. So it's where the Ministry of Justice steps in. So usually with most patients that are in these units on hospital orders, the consultant forensic psychiatrist is in charge of when they get leave, when they get discharged. But for the most riskiest patients that have committed this kind of level of crime, they have this extra layer of protection called a restriction order. So the Ministry of Justice need to give the nod for any decision. So if I think she's ready for leave or for discharge, I have to write to the Ministry of Justice, give them an update report, and they say yay or nay.
Wow. Good grief, this is absolutely fascinating. I wonder if you guys are as engaged as I am right now watching this out there. Please let us know in the comments what you think. So your book then, In Two Minds, how did you structure that?
I got a lot of help from an editor. So when I first wrote it, I tried to do it in sections. So in my career, I've worked in prisons, I've worked in courts, and I've worked in these secure units at different times. So I tried to do it like that, but I was convinced that it's better to do a sort of chronological flow. So I've just kind of gone through the last sort of 10 years of my life. I didn't initially want to talk about myself too much because it felt a bit like I was bragging, but my editor convinced me to put in little bits of what was going on in my life at the time. So it's more chronological, and then just bringing in cases that are interesting.
Yeah.
And I'll tell you what I found odd was that I've forgotten so many of my cases. So I've got them all in my files on my laptop, and I had to pull them up to get the details. But
How many cases are there over the years?
So I think I've probably assessed about 500 cases for criminal court. Yeah, probably about 1 or 2 a week generally.
And what made you want to get into this profession?
That's a good question. So I think I've always been a bit fascinated with criminality. So when I was a kid, I'd listen to gangster rap like NWA, Snoop Dogg, and I'd watch gangster films, Goodfellas, Scarface. I was just into it when I was a kid. And I never really thought that there is a profession that's sort of related to that in medicine. I kind of did medicine because my parents suggested that I should, not because I was particularly that driven to do it. Did a medical degree, became a doctor. At that stage, I didn't even know that forensic psychiatry existed. And then I kind of stumbled into psychiatry kind of accidentally, just because I had no plan, no clue of what I wanted to do when I graduated. I just spent all my uni days just messing around and just going out rather than concentrating and studying. And then suddenly I had this decision of what to specialize in. So I actually did other things first. I worked as an A&E doctor, and then I kind of did psychiatry, a placement on a whim in Australia. So I was living in Australia at the time, and I just connected to mentally ill people. I think the delusions and the thoughts and the stories they have, some of which are not based in reality, are just fascinating. And then after I came back to the UK, I trained in psychiatry, and then within psychiatry, there's lots of subspecialties. So child and adolescent, old age, for example, and forensics is a specialty. But I would argue that it's probably the least well known about and the most secretive, even within psychiatry, because there's not that many forensic units. So there's not that many placements. And I kind of did it on a whim, to be honest. So as a senior house officer, you move around every 6 months, and it was the very last placement that I did before I had to choose which one to specialize in before you become a registrar. So I didn't really necessarily think I was going to do it for a living. But then just from my first day on a forensic ward, I was just hooked, because you get to know, as well as the horrific nature of the crimes, you get to know the patients really intimately because they're there for a long period of time. So on a general adult ward, your patient might be there for typically a couple of months. You do get patients that are there for longer, but it's rare. But in a forensic psychiatry ward, because there's so many risks, and because generally they tend to be so unwell, they're there for years. So you get to really know them sort of intimately, and you get to meet their family, et cetera, et cetera. So I was just interested in the criminality side.
Well, you've got a really good vibe about you, and like a very soothing voice. And you mentioned earlier, like when you're talking to them, how you've got to present yourself in a certain way to get their trust. And like, I can imagine your vibe and your voice would be like, has like a tranquilizing effect on them, do you think? Versus someone who just comes in and is abrupt and discourteous.
I think that of all the fields of medicine, psychiatry, you need your communication skills have to be really sharp. Because a heart surgeon, whatever, they don't have to necessarily get the patient on side, but you need to in psychiatry. And I've certainly seen some. I think most psychiatrists are good. Most of my colleagues that I've worked with are good, but I've certainly seen some who are a bit abrupt. And you kind of have to adapt the assessment to whoever's in front of you, and you've got to think on your feet as you're doing it. So sometimes they're quite open and honest, and you can have a normal conversation. Sometimes you have to be very sort of gentle and soothe your way in, like with that young woman. Sometimes they're so ill that you've probably only got a 5-minute window to talk to them. Really? So all of the pleasantries goes out the window. You've got to try and get some symptomatology out of them as quickly as possible. Sometimes they're aggressive, so you got to watch that you don't provoke them even accidentally.
Have you been attacked?
So I've actually been punched twice in my career.
What led up to that?
Oddly, both incidents were actually really similar in that both times. So once was in Australia, so that was in a general non-forensic ward, and the second time was actually my very first day in a forensic unit, literally. And they were both quite similar in that I didn't know the guy. Both times they were men who I didn't know, never spoken to, both times they were, for some reason, transfixed on me when I got into the ward. Both times they kind of came up to me. One was actually in a wheelchair in Australia. He was just asking me these bizarre questions, which didn't really make sense.
What questions?
So the one in Australia was just asking me, he kept asking me where I was from, but he wasn't believing me when I answered. He was like, no, what's the truth? And I was like, I just told you. And then I kind of walked off and spoke to the patient that I was there to see. And this guy had 2 broken legs because he'd tried to commit suicide a couple of weeks earlier. So he had 2 broken legs. And he stood up on 2 broken legs.
No!
Punched me.
No!
Right on the back of the head. And I was facing a different way, so I didn't even see him coming.
Ah!
And I turned around the floor and I couldn't see anybody because he'd fallen on the floor because he's got 2 broken legs.
Whoa!
Like, what happened? And then
That is one of the craziest scenes I can possibly imagine.
And then on the forensic unit, it's very similar. It was a guy who was really transfixed with me. He was asking weird questions. So he seemed convinced that we knew each other from childhood. And he was saying things like, I'm sorry, I bullied you. I didn't mean to do that. And I was like, with respect, I've never met you before. And I was in an interview room interviewing another patient who I'd gone there to see. I was actually trying to show off to my consultant because it was my very first day. So I went in before the ward round to see some of my own patients so that I could say to my consultant, this is what I think. And then as soon as I walked out of the interview room, he ran up to me, punched me again from the side, so I didn't even see it coming. I was just like, fuck was that? And then the nurses had wrestled him onto the floor.
Yeah.
But the other thing is that both times, because there was no build up to threat, I didn't feel threatened. It wasn't that traumatic for me.
It's the anticipation, anxiety.
Yeah, exactly. Absolutely. Yeah. It just kind of happened. I was just like, both times.
It's over very fast.
Yeah. But I think what I think is quite interesting is that I don't generally feel unsafe or threatened when I'm in either prison or court, because broadly speaking, the people that I see want to make a good impression because they know that I'm writing an assessment for them.
Yeah.
So generally, even if they're nasty, antisocial, hostile, they'll tone it down to be polite to me generally. And the ones that are agitated and aggressive tend to be completely psychotic and they have no insights. They don't even know what's going on. And generally they're already either on a 2 or 3 man unlock, which, as I'm sure you know, means that the prison officers, there have to be 2 or 3 of them to let them out of the cell. Or if it's in court, then there's custody staff there. So generally the ones that are agitated and angry are already there's a layer of protection. So I think it's actually the secure units, the hospitals that where I felt the most threat, and both times where I was assaulted was in a psychiatric hospital. And to be fair, it's not like there's always an air of tension or aggression. It's not like that constantly. But by definition, the patients that are there have some level of previous violence or risk. So there's always a potential.
Yeah. So from my own incarceration experience, I learned there's a whole category of mentally ill people called shit slingers who specialize in doing things with poo. Have you encountered that in your profession?
Yes, I've seen quite a few. So it's immediately I'm thinking of healthcare units within prisons. So healthcare units are wards within a prison, and technically they're supposed to be there for psychiatric and physical patients. In my years of working as a prison psychiatrist, I barely saw anybody in there for physical issues. They were almost all psychotic, waiting to go to hospital. I've seen a lot of people, well, I say a lot, maybe 10 to 12 over my career who've had like dirty process, who put feces all over the wall. Very few actually slinging shit. I think maybe once or twice, and it wasn't to me, it was just what I've heard from the handover from the guards. I think maybe because I've worked mostly in female prisons, I think the level of shit slinging, I imagine, is a bit, the proportions.
So, have you assessed any serial killers or famous gangsters or anything like that?
No. So I have. So I think a misconception about forensic psychiatrists is that we kind of analyse serial killers.
Clarice.
Indeed, yeah. And I've only came across one case of a man who's killed multiple times, 3 times. But all 3 times they were ex-partners, so that's not technically a serial killer because it's not. Like
whoa, slow down. So you had to diagnose a man who'd killed 3 times. Yeah. Had he got away with 3 murders and he was in prison, or had he got released, killed, got released, killed?
The latter. Yeah.
Go on, give us the whole story, please.
So again, this is a one-off assessment, so he wasn't my patient on an inpatient ward. So
you didn't send him back out into the world to kill again.
That's not my fault. But what happened was, so everything that I know is from the notes.
Yeah.
So he was in his 60s, I think, when I saw him. It was probably 5 or 6 years ago, a while ago. And the first time it was with an ex-partner. I think they'd had an argument on a balcony, and he pushed her off. and he got a finding or a mitigation of self-defense because they were actually physically having a fight. So I think he served something like 3 or 4 years.
That was the first one, was it?
That was the first one, yeah. That was back in the 80s, yeah.
Okay.
At that point, there was no concerns about this man's mental health at all.
Yeah.
Second time, I think, was mid-90s, and he, again, there was no indication that mental illness drove the offence, but it was, again, a domestic abuse kind of situation. He again had an argument with a partner, and I think he hit her over the head repeatedly with an ashtray, and killed her, and had quite a long prison sentence for that one.
Really?
And it was while he was in prison that his mental health deteriorated quite significantly. So he developed quite a severe depression to the point he wasn't eating, wasn't sleeping, wasn't eating for weeks. So he got transferred to a psychiatric unit, and then he got sort of tied in with the forensic psychiatry services. And he, to all intents and purposes, from what I can tell, seemed rehabilitated. So you can't keep your patients in there indefinitely forever. I mean, there's humanitarian reasons, but also practical reasons, because you need the beds to open up. You need a flow of patients. You have to discharge patients at some point so that new patients can come in. Otherwise, you'll just have psychotic people in prison that need mental health treatment. So to all intents and purposes, he seemed rehabilitated. He'd been using his lever well. He had not caused any problems on the wards pretty much for the entire time he was there. No arguments, no pushing boundaries with nurses, etc. So he got released, and he was under supervision by both the Ministry of Justice and Forensic Services as well. The one thing that was a bit dodgy is that he was supposed to inform his social worker or his psychiatrist every time he was in a new romantic relationship, or if he moves into a house with like a minor in it. And he started a new romantic relationship that ended up being his third victim. And he didn't tell anybody about that. So that was arguably one sort of risk factor. But then when the team spoke to this woman, she seemed indifferent, frankly, to his history. She kind of loved him anyway, and just wanted to be in this relationship despite what she was told. And then sort of maybe 2 years after that first contact with the team, he had another argument. He ended up strangling and killing this woman, then immediately tried to kill himself. So he ran out, like literally immediately afterwards, and jumped in front of a bus. And then when I saw him in prison, he was like in a wheelchair. So he was in a wheelchair. He had like both of his arms amputated. And which oddly, I don't have to word this carefully, but perversely, that actually helps with his risk management, because it means that if he ever does get released in the future, he's far less risky, because you can't kill people with no arms, basically.
Good grief! I'm stunned. The second murder victim, did she know about the first? Do you know?
I don't know. Because unfortunately, I've only got the notes to go by, because he wasn't really telling me anything, and I think things were far less well documented in the 80s and 90s. There weren't all the reports and everything, all the admin stuff that we have to do now. So you just basically can only go on what the doctor decided to write.
Third murder victim, do you know what started the argument, what it's about?
Yes, I do actually, because I've got his version of it. Obviously, that was it. So she was supposed to help him with some sort of paperwork, like getting his driving license, I think. And they didn't live together, but she lived around the corner, and apparently she didn't turn up. He got really angry, and then she came around the next morning to go with him to do the paperwork. And according to him, she attacked him first. But obviously we don't know that to be true.
So for this to happen 3 times, like he got a pass on the first one, self-defense, do you think he was playing the system?
Good question, Sean. I mean, I don't think he was intending to kill another person or to kill another partner in the future. I don't think he thought, right, as soon as I'm getting out of here, I'm going to start another relationship and I'm going to kill her too. I don't think. I can't know for definite. Yeah. But I think obviously, clearly, he's a dangerous man who's got a pattern. But at the risk of trying to sound too defensive about my profession, you can only go on what you see. You can't predict if anybody's going to be dangerous in the future. And you can't keep somebody in indefinitely. Particularly in prison, there's a sentence. When you get to the end of the sentence, unless there's good reason, you get released. In forensic psychiatric units, there is no sentence. It's up to the consultant to decide when you discharge somebody. But you can't keep people in indefinitely, again, because it just clogs up the system. So you can only go with what's in front of you. And what's in front of you is whether they've engaged in treatment, whether they're taking their medications, whether they're listening to boundaries on the ward, whether they're starting problems with other people on the ward. So it's not too dissimilar to prison in that people have a history of violence. There's a lot of young, angry men. So as you'd imagine, there's beefs and there's arguments. So there's a lot of opportunity for people to fall out. And he, like many other patients, at least on the surface, seemed absolutely fine. There was no violence or aggression. Given leave, used his leave appropriately, came back on time, passed his drug tests and his breathalyzers, etc. So it's quite hard to justify keeping somebody in indefinitely. When most of your patients have this kind of background. I mean, killing a number of times is unusual, but everyone has some sort of history of violence to be there in the first place. So you've got to make a decision to discharge people at some point.
What kind of a sentence did he get on the third one?
On the third one, so I think his lawyers were trying to push me to suggest that he had, well, he did have mental illness, he had depression, but to suggest that he was not criminally culpable. But I didn't believe that at all. I think he perfectly knew what he was doing. So I took away the suggestion of a psychiatric defense. So he ended up with a prison sentence. Off the top of my head, I think it was 9 or 10 years altogether.
9 or 10 years, that's it?
Yeah, I think so.
3 people dead.
Yeah.
Whoa. Wow, I'm just absolutely mind blown by that.
I suppose, I don't know this for a fact, but this is just speculation, but I suppose because of the injuries, he was not seen as high risk as an able-bodied person. Yeah.
Good grief. Well, these are absolutely fascinating. So what other killer cases then have you assessed? Like, you've done 500 cases. How many of them are killers?
Probably not that many, actually. Probably less than 10.
Less than 10?
Yeah. So the vast majority are attempted murder, assault, arson, sometimes sexual assaults.
Yeah. Let's continue down the list of the killers then. What's the next one that you found particularly harrowing or challenging?
I'm trying to think. So there is another murder case. I have seen other murder cases, but to be honest, they're not that. There's not, apart from the ones I've talked about, they weren't that interesting. So I was only there to rule out mental illness. So of the defendants that I see, for medico-legal work as an expert witness, by far most of them either don't have a mental illness, or if they do, they weren't so unwell that they didn't know what they were doing. So they don't get the insanity plea. So my role is to sift the actual ones that are mentally ill and need to go to hospital from the ones that are not. So the other murder cases I've seen have not been that interesting in that there was not really any psychiatry. I was just there to rule out. Actually, having said that, there is another one that's just jumped onto my mind. Yeah, it's got slightly spooky similarities to the other guy who ended up in a wheelchair, because this perpetrator, as I'll tell you, also ended up in a wheelchair.
Oh my goodness.
So there is a farmer who I assessed 3-4 years ago. He was in a prison in Manchester. And he had basically, him and his wife had separated. They were not divorced yet, but they were going through proceedings. And his wife was having another relationship, and he knew about this. And his wife, he basically found his wife and this man in a pub. She went home and he followed her home, got a shotgun, and he shot her dead in front of their teenage son. And then he turned the gun on himself and tried to kill himself, shot himself in the face basically, but didn't die. So when I saw him, it was probably about 2 months later. He was also in a wheelchair, very severely disfigured. He didn't have a jaw, didn't have a bottom half of the face, and the plastic surgeons had tried to reconstruct his face. But the thing that I remember was that they'd taken grafts of his skin, and the grafts were different colours. So it just looked really weird. There was different flaps of skin that were all slightly different shades. And he couldn't speak because he didn't have a face, and he had to communicate through an iPad. So I just remember sitting there and I asked him, and he couldn't type shit.
What was his attitude towards what he'd done?
Well, actually, I have to say, so he did have mental health illnesses in that he was genuinely depressed, I think, and he was an alcoholic. But again, generally speaking, those kind of illnesses don't change your criminal culpability in the way that a psychosis can, like hearing voices, for example. To his credit, he completely took responsibility. He didn't try and weasel his way out of it at all. He told me straight up, I completely regret what I did. I was in a jealous rage. I tried to kill myself. I wish I was dead right now. I take full responsibility. So yeah, unlike a lot of defendants, he just sort of fessed up to it. And even when I was asking about the mental health symptoms, he even told me, he said, look, you can ask these questions, but it doesn't make a difference. I know what I did. But obviously I had to do the assessment properly for the court report.
What did the court rule on that one?
That's quite straightforward. So he just got a prison sentence.
Like how long?
I actually don't know, I'm afraid, because I've put in the evidence and then I gave evidence in the trial. But
so again, he would probably have got a reduced sentence because he was like, he couldn't really harm people in the future because of his disability.
I think it depends on the judge, but I think that's one of the factors we take into account. Yeah.
Wow, this is insane. So in Arizona, then I think I learned that prison was the biggest houser of mentally ill people. Have you ever worked in Broadmoor?
I did work in Broadmoor as a registrar, yeah. So as a middle grade psychiatrist, but I was there as a special interest. So I went there once a week for about 7 or 8 months altogether.
Really?
Yeah.
You're the first person I think we've interviewed who's worked in Broadmoor, isn't he? Because we've got a documentary coming out about Jimmy Savile.
Right.
And
if you ever want some sound bites, I'd be happy to provide them.
Yeah, that's good. Let's do it. What do you think about Jimmy Savile being given access to Broadmoor?
Yeah, it's just insane. Absolutely blows my mind. Because now, and in the recent past, in the last sort of 5-10 years, the security of Broadmoor is really high. So every time I went in, even the regular members of staff, even the consultant psychiatrists who work there every day, they had to go through an airport level of security to get in and get out every time. And there's really lengthy background checks. So not too dissimilar to working in a prison. So, once you apply for your job and you get the job, there's another at least 4 or 5 months of them doing security vetting. So that's what happens now for staff to get into Broadmoor. So taking that into context, somebody who's not even a staff member to be given his own keys, he's a celebrity. I just can't understand it, cannot fathom.
Are the high security measures now in response to cases like Savile's?
I think they're probably more in response to what happens in Broadmoor and the risk of patients in Broadmoor rather than Jimmy Savile specifically. Yeah.
What does happen in Broadmoor?
What do you mean?
You said it's more of a case of what actually happens in Broadmoor. What does actually happen?
So I can tell you about my experience. So I worked in the high dependency unit. So that wasn't the most riskiest level. It's the second from the top. And oddly, I have to say, it actually felt quite safe. And the reason it felt quite safe was because the patients there, most of them are probably never leaving hospital. So I think there was maybe 10 there altogether. At least half, maybe even more, was so unwell, even with years worth of antipsychotic treatments, even with combinations, high doses. Their mental illness just was so entrenched and so severe that they would never get better. And so they're managed in a way that keeps them safe. So for example, they're kept in long-term seclusion. So unlike most patients in most psychiatric units, they're in their cells for 22, 23 hours a day. And they're only let out. Some of them have had previous fights and previous beefs. So the nurses I have to say the nurses are excellent at Broadmoor. They're really clued up onto who can be out in the same time in the communal areas to make sure that they don't have problems. And there's such a high level of observation. So even if I was speaking to a patient just to have a chat or just to check their mental state, for example, we changed the dose of their medication a couple of weeks ago. I want to see how they're doing. Even if I'm just sitting with them, there'd be a nurse who'd only be tasked with sitting in the corner of the room or on the other side of the glass window, checking on us. So paradoxically, even though it's the most violent patients, I actually felt the safest, and I felt safer than when I worked in medium secure units, of which I've spent far more time in, because the patients are walking around and there are, people that don't get on, and there are people that are psychotic. So I actually experienced more violence in the medium secure units, and the atmosphere was tenser than it was in Broadmoor. Yeah.
So how big is Broadmoor? Like how many patients and how are they categorised?
Now you're asking. So since I've worked there, they've actually moved sites. So the new building, I can't say exactly, but I think it's something around 150 patients maybe, but you'll have to double check, I'm afraid. So they're generally categorised in terms of how far down the rehabilitation pathway they are. So you've got your acute patients that come in straight away, and they're going to be assessed for probably a minimum of 6 months. So you actually know fully what their risks are and potentially what they can do in what scenario, what situation. You've got a handle on what their diagnosis is and what medications they need. And then depending on how quickly they appear to be improving, there's different streams of rehabilitation. So there's some wards where you're expecting them to be discharged within 3-4 years. And there's other streams where, like the place I was working, where they might be there for decades, if not forever. So they tend to be categorized on how, not just how dangerous they are, but how quickly they're likely to move through the system.
Yeah, because like the Craze was in there, weren't they? Peter Sutcliffe, the Yorkshire Ripper was in there.
So I've done videos on all of those people that you've mentioned.
Have you?
Channel. Yeah.
So what did you have to say on the Yorkshire Ripper?
So the Yorkshire Ripper that's Peter Sutcliffe. The thing that I think is the most interesting about the case is that I think that he was clearly psychotic when he did what he did when he murdered those women.
Didn't he say something religious as well? This seems to be a recurring theme, the religious thing.
Yeah. And so he clearly had a range of psychotic symptoms. So he was hearing voices. He was convinced that he'd met the Queen in a bar. Like he actually genuinely thought it was the Queen. And there were some other just odd statements that he'd made. But he was not found. There was no sort of psychiatric defense, and he was not transferred to hospital initially, even though a number of forensic psychiatrists, I think there was something like 3 or 4 forensic psychiatrists that said, he's clearly psychotic, he needs hospital. But the judge and the jury overturned that. They basically ignored the evidence, which is their right to do. We don't have the legal authority to make decisions about people's disposals. We can only advise. The majority of the time, the judge listens to us. Sometimes they don't. And then he was transferred to prison. I think he was attacked a couple of times in prison, and then eventually was sent to Broadmoor. I think maybe about 2 years roughly from when he was first imprisoned, which suggests to me that he was psychotic and he was unwell the whole time, because you don't have these psychotic symptoms, then they disappear and then they come back 2 years later. It's very unlikely. So I think that the nature of his offences were so extreme that the public just wanted to bay for blood, which I can understand that sentiment. I'm a doctor, I'm a psychiatrist, so my perspective is that if somebody needs treatment, they need treatment. I try and take the ethical issues out of it and the moral justifications. Not to say I don't have thoughts, I keep them separate. But I can understand why members of the public, just want to see this man punished. So I think that's why he was sent to prison, but he should have actually gone to hospital, in my view, from the beginning.
So did he have a family at the time of these murders?
I honestly don't know. I don't know.
Do you know anything about his relationship with Jimmy Savile? Because there's theories that they had a relationship before the murders.
No, I don't know, I'm afraid.
Okay. So you said you did a video on the Craze?
Yep.
What did you have to say on them?
On Ronnie Gray. So what I think is quite interesting about the Craze is I think there's a number of explanations of why they turned out to be antisocial. So I think the fact that they didn't really have much of a father figure. I think the fact that they run around in quite a tight circle. So I think because they're in this little gang, they almost gave each other permission to break the law. I think they were quite diverse in their criminal activities. And I think because they became such celebrities and because they ruled with intimidation, they almost had to keep up this image of being really violent and really notorious. And Ronnie in particular, as you know, he was bisexual. Some people say he was gay. And I think that was less accepted back in the time. So that was the 60s or 70s? 60s, isn't it?
We just did the Craze tour, didn't we, this week?
60s.
What was the era of the Craze? 60s.
Yeah, especially back in the 60s. I think he was hypersensitive to being publicly insulted. Plus, you throw in paranoid schizophrenia, which is what he was diagnosed with. On top of that, you got an extra level of paranoia. Mm. So I think all of those things in combined, made him lash out, act out, kill the person that he killed. The other thing that I think is quite unique about the Craze is that there's always questions of nature versus nurture, like why people become violent, why people offend. What you've got is an extremely unusual situation because you've got 2 genetically identical people, one of whom has schizophrenia and one of whom doesn't, right? So schizophrenia tends to run in families, and if one twin has it, there's something like a 70 or 80% chance that the other one will have it as well. Because it's not one inherited gene, it's just like a cluster of genes. But you've got the situation where you've got one with it and one without it. And interestingly, both of them turned out quite antisocial. Both of them were violent. Both of them offended. You could argue that maybe Ronnie was a bit more violent because he actually got done for murder, whereas Reggie didn't. Did I get that correct? Or did they both get done for the murder of their associate? Both of them. But then Ronnie got an extra murder on top of that. So you can see that they were both destined to be antisocial because they're genetically identical. Then you add in a layer of paranoid schizophrenia and he becomes slightly more violent. So yeah.
Any other high-profile criminals you've done videos
on? Yes. One that really stands out in my mind is Andrea Yates.
Who's Andrea Yates?
So she's got big similarities to the other two women that I was mentioning earlier. So Andrea Yates is a nurse who in 2001 in Houston, she drowned and killed her own five children.
Oh, in Houston?
In Houston, yeah.
Oh. And what was your analysis of her?
So there's a couple of interesting aspects of this case. So I think that she had this postnatal psychosis that I was talking about. So she had 5 kids and after each one, she would get unwell. And during one of her hospital treatments, she was discharged early from hospital because the insurance companies wouldn't pay for a whole stay. So she was slightly better than when she first came in, but she was still not eating, not drinking, and they still discharged her because they refused to pay for her. And then months after that is when the killings happened. And she methodically drowned all of her all of her children individually. And the oldest one was a 7-year-old boy, and he figured out what was going on. So he tried to run away, and she chased him and dragged him back and killed him.
Oh my God.
Yeah. And I've got an 8-year-old son, so particularly kind of rings to me emotionally.
Was she hearing voices and stuff?
Yeah. So it's immediately afterwards she phones her husband who's working. So it's actually very similar to the other case talking about her husband was working at NASA. Phones him and tells him what he's done. Then she calls the police herself. And she was convinced that there was something wrong with the children. They'd been marked by Satan. And she was seeing like demonic images. Even in prison, she was seeing like cartoon characters, like devil cartoon characters in the walls. She was hearing a voice. She was hearing a voice that was telling her to go and grab a weapon. Then she committed her offence. And actually not too dissimilar to the Yorkshire Ripper, what actually happened was that even though she was clearly psychotic, the jury were swayed to send her down for murder. So she actually started with a murder charge in prison. And that was very heavily influenced by the evidence of a forensic psychiatrist like myself called Dr. Dietz. And Dr. Dietz was, I think fair to say, a little bit dodgy. So for a start, he wasn't an expert in postnatal psychosis. I think you could argue because it's quite a rare disorder that you don't have to be an expert to give evidence in that one specific illness if you understand psychosis in general. So I would feel comfortable giving evidence in postnatal psychosis, even though I've only seen a few cases, because I understand I've seen hundreds of cases of psychosis. But he'd not practiced, he'd been doing his private medico-legal work, but he'd not seen a patient in 20 years. So that's a little bit dodgy, right? You can't really say that you've kept your psychiatric skills up to date and sharp if you've not done that. Plus he was quite, he worked in high profile shows like Law and Order. So he actually insinuated during the trial that there was an episode of Law and Order on shortly before where a mother killed the children and tried to get away with the defense of not guilty by reason of insanity. And it turned out later after the trial that was just bullshit. There was no such episode. So years later, she had a retrial. And during the retrial, she was eventually found not guilty by reason of insanity, sent to a psychiatric hospital, where I believe she's in to this day.
So she's still in hospital to this day. That was 20 years ago.
But that really sort of struck me, again, obviously because of the tragic nature of what she did, but also because it's just so similar to cases that I've seen personally.
What was her name again so I can Google that one?
Andrea Yates.
Andrea Yates. And that was 2001, did you say?
Yeah.
Oh yeah, I was in America then, so it was probably on the news out there. Okay, so the mentally ill then, the biggest hazard of mentally ill is the prison system in America. Is that the same for the UK?
No, I think there are more people in psychiatric hospitals who are severely mentally ill. I suppose it depends how you define mentally ill. Yeah. Like around half of prisoners have some sort of mental illness, but that would be, the majority of those would be anxiety or depression. So I'm not trying to detract from those mental illnesses, but I'm talking about, need hospital, kind of that level of illness.
Yeah.
There are more in psychiatric hospitals, definitely.
So let's just take a break from all of the cases a second, just go over some of the terminology.
Sure.
I think people need a break after hearing all those stories. So you meant earlier on, you said paranoid schizophrenic. Mm-hmm. What is a paranoid schizophrenic?
So schizophrenia is a mental illness that affects about 1% of the population. I think it's very slightly overrepresented in males, just by a little bit. And it's periods of psychosis. So psychosis is where you step out of reality. The two most common symptoms of psychosis are hallucinations and delusions. So hallucinations are seeing or hearing things that don't exist. Contrary to popular belief, most people with schizophrenia hear voices. It's actually quite rare for them to have visual hallucinations.
They mostly hear voices.
Yeah. So hearing things is far more common than seeing things, despite what you might see on TV programs, etc. Which, by the way, is a way that you can spot when a defendant's lying, but that's a different topic. And they suffer delusions. So delusions are false, fixed beliefs that will not change, even if there's evidence to the contrary. So typical delusions are paranoid delusions, which is exactly what you get in paranoid schizophrenia. So of cases that I see, by far the common types tend to be people are watching me, people are following me, either people that the defendant knows or that are complete random strangers. People want to kill me. People are poisoning my food. I've seen several prisoners who will only eat packaged food because they believe, for no discernible reason, they believe that their food's being poisoned. People that they're dying. And then you get other types of delusions, like grandiose delusions, where people believe they can read minds or have superpowers or can fly. And yeah.
So how many schizophrenics are of the paranoid type?
Good question. I think the majority of people with schizophrenia have paranoid schizophrenia. Yeah. So I think well over a half generally tend to be. That's how it presents. Yeah.
Over half are paranoid schizophrenics.
Yeah.
And out of all of the violent crime that occurs from the mentally ill, what proportion of that comes from paranoid schizophrenics? So
I should say, because I wouldn't want to add to the stigma against mental illness. So I would really sort of like to highlight that the vast majority of people who have mental illness are not violent.
Yeah.
It just happens to be that I work in the field that's exactly that overlap. So in terms of serious crimes like murder, I think quite a high proportion of them are done by people with schizophrenia. I think something like 10%.
10% of murders are done by schizophrenics.
I think so, yeah.
And what are the warning signs people could look for then, like just hearing people say strange things?
Well, the problem is that because the vast majority of people with mental illnesses like schizophrenia are not violent, it's one thing to identify the mental illness, but it's a whole different ballgame to actually identify the risks, which is where you need a specialist like a forensic psychiatrist. But to answer your question, so generally people with schizophrenia have those symptoms I was talking about. So they're hearing voices or they're transfixed on ideas or thoughts or conspirational beliefs that are clearly not true. But they also tend to have quite significant cognitive decline. So you can be quite paranoid but not have schizophrenia. But somebody with schizophrenia generally, there are exceptions, but generally they struggle with work, with relationships. They tend to need to go in and out of hospital. So their ability to function massively decreases, which is called social drift. So they tend to drift towards joblessness, homelessness, drug use. Yeah.
Have you watched the White House Farm Murders on Netflix?
No, I've heard of it.
So
but I know. What was the name of the
Jeremy
perpetrator?
Bamber.
Yeah, I know a little bit about him though. Yeah.
Oh, do you? What do you know about Bamber?
So the reason I know this is because I was a guest on another podcast about the murders, even though I've not seen any documentaries on it. So I know that he tried to set up his schizophrenic sister as committing these murders. So he murdered his entire family, I believe.
He was convicted of it. Yeah,
right.
We're trying to research this more.
Okay.
There's a guy we're working with who believes he's innocent.
Okay, I've heard that there's a movement of people that believe that actually.
So we're trying to get to the bottom of it. It's tricky though, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
What kind of things have you found out?
Not much yet, but we're going to be meeting with the team, and we're going to be doing some podcasts with the team that represent him. So we're hoping to find out a lot.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, watching that show on Netflix, you could see how the women who provided the information that convicted him had a lot to gain.
Right.
the cousin, basically everything he was going to inherit went to her.
Okay.
And his girlfriend had already sold a story to the News of the World for tens of thousands.
Right. Okay, I didn't know that.
Yeah. So there's a lot to it. Even though that show made him look guilty, from my experience in the justice system, there was a lot of red flags.
Yeah.
Yeah. Because I wrote a book, Unmaking a Murderer, about the Stephen Avery and Brendan Dassey cases on Making a Murderer.
Yeah.
And there's 10 things that always reoccur when there's no physical evidence as to how they convict people.
Yeah.
And I saw a lot of that reoccurring in his case. So definitely something we want to look at much stronger. Yeah.
Okay. Again, if you need any sound bites, I'll do my research.
Yeah.
I'll find out about his case.
Okay. Yeah. Thanks. All right. So, is there a mental disorder then that is more prolific in murder than schizophrenia?
Yes. So personality disorder. Yeah.
Personality disorders.
Yeah. So this is often misunderstood. So there's a difference between a mental illness and a personality disorder. So a mental illness is, it could be seen as a baseline change of what you usually are because you've got symptoms. So if it's psychosis, then those symptoms are, as I said before, hearing voices, seeing things. If it's, for example, mania, then those symptoms are, being speeded up, having all this energy, flight of ideas. If it's something like depression, as I'm sure you know, low mood, lack of energy, etc. Whereas a personality disorder is entrenched in you. So if you've got a personality disorder, it means that your character traits are flawed by definition. So it's part of you. It's related to, your upbringing, your experiences, etc. So I should say I've made videos on personality disorders and I've got quite a bit of backlash because they are quite a contentious diagnosis. And some people who are diagnosed feel that they're labeled as troublemakers. And I can understand where that comes from because I've certainly seen in my career doctors and nurses who say that's just PD, that's just personality disorder, which I take to mean that they're just causing trouble for the sake of it. They know what they're doing. They're not hearing voices, for example. So I agree with that. It is a contentious diagnosis, but the definition of a personality disorder is that your personality traits are flawed. So when it comes to violence, by far the most common personality disorder is antisocial personality disorder. So people that have this disorder tend to not care about the rights of other people. They treat people with like this callous indifference. They don't care about them. They don't care about following the law. They don't really learn from their mistakes. So even if they get punished, even if they get sent to prison, they never really change. I'm sure through your experience in prison, you must have met a lot of people with this kind of disorder.
Would you say that they are also overlap with psychopaths?
Yes, absolutely. So psychopaths is like antisocial personality disorder plus. So you've got all of those traits plus you're really charming and you're really manipulative.
Right.
And another difference is that people with antisocial personality disorder can have empathy towards some people. So you can go out in the streets, be a thug, be a drug dealer, beat people up, but you still love your mum, you still love your family.
Yeah.
Whereas a true psychopath, of which I've worked with a few, have no empathy for anybody. So they can still be in a marriage, they might have kids, but they deep down to their core, they only really care about themselves, and they only really see other people as an opportunity to manipulate, to get something from. So they might have friends, but they don't really value their friendship. So for example, I've seen psychopaths on wards. So I've worked in personality wards when I did my training, and I've seen a couple of psychopaths, and they would like a lot of wards, there was like alliances and cliques. I wouldn't call them gangs, but there were men that hung out together and had friendships. And a true psychopath would drop their friend like that if it suited them. So if a friend had provided a positive urine drug test, for example, and the psychopath doesn't want to lose his leave, he'll like disassociate himself with that. Or if a friend's been accused of doing something, then a true psychopath will just cut ties immediately, would have no qualms.
What's the most dangerous psychopathic case you've encountered?
That I've encountered myself?
Yeah.
So I think probably the murder cases that I talked about before, particularly the man who had killed a few times before. I don't think he ever got a formal diagnosis of being a psychopath, but he clearly used, the 3 murders aside, he used people and he used women to get what he wanted. He would form these relationships, I think, to set himself up in the community. And he didn't seem to learn from his mistakes, which is a very typical from a psychopath. So that's probably one of the main ones.
What was this case you were interested in, James?
The Rachel Nickel murder.
Rachel?
Nickel.
Oh, Nickel. What's that case?
So the reason that I know about this case, the reason I've studied this case, because we were taught about it during our training, because it kind of, in my view, highlights how non-scientific and non-reliable criminal profiling is. And as a forensic psychiatrist, it's quite a common misconception. They think that's what we do. It's not. We've got nothing to do with solving crimes at all. So the case was in 1992. There was a young lady called Rachel Nickel. She was only 23. She was young, model. I think she had a 3-year-old son at the time. And in Wimbledon Common, she was completely randomly and senselessly attacked by a stranger who stabbed her, I think, over 50 or 60 times, killed her in front of her son. And what had happened was the police had some suspects, and they drafted in this very renowned forensic psychologist, arguably probably one of the most famous in the country. And he set up this criminal profile of what he thought the perpetrator would be like demographically. And the police had a number of suspects, including the person that actually carried it out, who I'll come back to later, and a completely innocent man called Colin Stagg. And they were convinced that Colin Stagg was the perpetrator because of this criminal profile that was built up. So they actually set up like a honey trap, like a sting operation, where they got an attractive female undercover cop to start a romantic relationship with Colin Stagg and try and coax out a confession about the killing of Rachel Nickel. And alarmingly, he didn't even confess to that. So I think there's transcripts of the actual conversations, and he basically said, look, I know you want me to say that I killed this woman, but I didn't kill her. I don't know what to tell you. I didn't do it. Despite that, the police still arrested him, and he's still put on remand for 8 months. Then he had a trial at the Old Bailey, and it was thrown out immediately. And the police were heavily criticised, as was the psychologist. And then years later down the line, because DNA technology had caught up, they discovered that it was the real perpetrator was a man called Robert Napper. And he was actually a patient at Broadmoor at the time. So he had paranoid schizophrenia, and he killed another random woman whose name was Samantha Bissett. And they linked the DNA to him. But so for me, the most sort of shocking part is that if it wasn't for this criminal profile, because the police actually had him as a suspect at one point, if it wasn't for this criminal profile, they might have got the right person. They might have prevented this other senseless murder.
So the art of criminal profiling then, where did that originate?
So I think it originated in America, actually. So I think it was connected to the FBI from decades ago, from like the 60s. But I think that me personally, the reason I don't believe in it is first of all, there's no scientific studies to prove that it actually
Is this
works.
going back to Mindhunter and all that stuff?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Number one. And number two, it makes certain assumptions, and the assumptions are that different people act the same way, and that a criminal carries out his offences in the same way. And I just don't think that's true, even in people that I've assessed. And again, the vast majority are not murders, but in people that I've assessed, their crimes or their MOs are sort of random, they're impulsive, they don't necessarily follow a pattern. I think some people probably do follow a pattern, but you can't assume that, and you can't use it to narrow down suspects, in my view. As I think is reflected in the Rachel Nickel case, it can actually be quite damaging, I think.
In the Rachel Nickel case, this suspect then that was innocent, what had put him on the radar of the criminal profiler? Did he have a history of anything?
I'm not entirely sure. I know he was seen as a bit of an odd man. I know that. I know he was a bit of a loner. And I think he used to wander around that area. I don't think he had a serious history of violent crimes as far as I'm aware. No.
Just like a Boo Radley situation. To Kill a Mockingbird. All right, so you mentioned then personality disorders. So does that mean like borderline personality disorder? Is that one of them?
Yeah. So
what does that even mean?
Okay, so when it comes to personality disorders that are related to violence and offending, as I said before, number one, by far the most common one I see is antisocial personality disorder.
Antisocial.
Number two is borderline.
Oh, is it?
So borderline is also known as emotionally unstable personality disorder. And people who suffer from this tend to have mood swings, big mood swings. They're never fully happy with themselves. They're never fully happy with their identity. So they often, change their circle of friends or change their image just because they're never really happy with who they are in the core. They often self-harm, and they often take drugs, and they have quite explosive relationships. So the difference between somebody antisocial who offends versus somebody with borderline who offends, in my experience, is that antisocial people see offending as a lifestyle. So violence is how they earn their living, basically. Whereas generally people with borderline tend to not want to be habitual offenders, but they can't contain their emotions. So they get into an argument with their boyfriends or their girlfriends or their parents, and they just explode in this rage and they regret it afterwards. Whereas somebody with antisocial personality, it's what they do. They regret getting caught, but they don't regret their behavior. But I should also say that there's a lot of people with borderline who live fulfilled lives and are able to contain their symptoms and their behaviors. I'm not saying that everybody with this disorder is aggressive or violent. It's just the people that I tend to see.
Who's more manipulative? Psychopaths, antisocial, borderline?
Psychopaths.
Psychopaths.
Yeah.
Because
by definition, you have to be manipulative to be a psychopath, whereas you don't have to have that trait for the other two.
Do you have a case of a borderline that gave you some particular challenges?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. So I remember there was one young man so this was when I was working as a consultant in a secure ward. So this is different from one-off assessments. This is when I had responsibility for rehabilitating the patients. And there was one young man, and he was actually quite charming. He was quite funny when he wanted to be, but he could also be quite nasty when he got angry. And he was an absolute nightmare to discharge, just really difficult to discharge, because he just wouldn't stick with the rules. So every time he would behave himself on the ward to get leave, and then when he got leave, he would go out and he would come back on time for weeks in a row until it got escalated to unescorted leave, and then he would go out and drink, come back drunk, be a bit aggressive, a bit arsey. He actually physically put hands on me on one occasion, actually, so he pushed me into a wardrobe once, when I was telling him off.
Do you have a protocol when something like that happens?
Yeah, I didn't follow it. You should pull your alarm, and so there's an emergency nursing team that come in and if necessary restrain and medicate and put them into seclusion. But I just didn't think it was that necessary, and I didn't. Maybe it's the wrong call, but I didn't feel that threatened, and I kind of calmed him down. And I was also just quite frustrated because his admission was lasting so long, because he kept breaking the boundaries, that I just didn't want another mark to go against his name, which would put him in put him back for another few months.
How did you calm him down?
I think so basically what happened was, and this is quite typical for some people with borderline, I think he was pushing the boundaries by coming back a little bit late, drinking a little bit, but not enough, enough to register on the breathalyzer. He didn't seem drunk. And I gave him a couple of passes because I didn't want to stop his leave, because his leave had been stopped so many times in the past. I didn't want to just start from square one and extend his admission. Yeah. So I gave him a couple of passes, and I think he was just sort of pushing it to see how far he can get. And then I had to stop his leave because he was doing it too often, and he came back properly drunk once. And then he refused to come out of his room. So I saw him in his room, which is actually pretty stupid on my part, but I shouldn't have done that. But I was just busy, and so I saw him in the room, as opposed to finding a separate room and finding nurses that were available. And I think after he pushed me, you could tell in his face that he was like a bit shocked at what he'd done. And so I just sort of talked him down and just said, the weird thing is being in that situation, and I wouldn't say it happens very often, but it certainly happened a handful of times in my career, is that I can't argue back or fight back or say what I'm really thinking, because I'm the professional. So I can't. Somebody yells at me or swears at me or gives me racist abuse, I can't.
But
I can't really
allowed
stand
to
up
self-defend.
Yeah, absolutely. You can self-defend. But I can't escalate an argument.
Yeah.
So I couldn't say what I was really thinking, which would be full of expletives. I just kind of said, look, I think we can both tell that you're getting a bit too agitated, and we're not going to get any further here. So I'm going to leave now. And he let me leave. But so I'll tell you what's interesting about his case was that finally, when we finally, so he's from the Milton Keynes area, and when we finally discharged him, we've kept finding these hostels for him to go to, and every time there was some sort of problem, he would either didn't like the hostel, or he wouldn't stick with the boundaries when he had like leave testing. And then on one final time, we found a hostel for him to be discharged to, and he went away on a weekend. And the community mental health team based in Milton Keynes wouldn't work with him because he was just too much of a handful. So as an alternative, he had to go to. No, sorry, I've said this wrong. It wasn't a hostel. He was going to go and stay with his mother because no hostels would take him. Sorry, I got that mixed up. Had to stay with his mother because no hostels would take him. But there was a community centre that was nearby. So the plan was, it wasn't a perfect plan, but the plan was stay with your mother and you have to go into this community centre every day initially, 5 days a week, have therapy. If you can show that you're stable and you're behaving yourself, then that will decrease over time. You get more freedom. So he reluctantly agreed because it's the only way he could leave hospital. So we had him on this test weekend where he had to go up, stay with his mother, and go to this thing twice, go on the Saturday and Sunday. He turned up, his mother disappeared off the scene. He had like a 2-day party, basically, took loads of drugs. He turned up to the first session stinking of booze and then left after like half an hour. He's supposed to be there all day. Didn't even turn up to the second session. And then when the nurse from our ward drove up to collect him on the Monday morning, there was like people, he's obviously had like a 2-day party. There's like drugs on the floor, condoms on the floor, people passed out. Yeah.
How old was he?
He was not that old, in mid-20s, I think. Yeah.
And what crime had he done in the first place?
So in the first place, he'd set a fire with his mother in the house. Ooh. I think he was psychotic, to be fair. I don't think he intended to kill her. I think he intended to kill himself. So he set a fire, but he'd locked the door and he had the key on him, so his mother couldn't get out. So the neighbours had to put a brick through the window. So obviously it's not ideal to discharge this person to his mother's house, given the history, but we literally had no other options because he'd burnt his bridges with every single person. So to go back to the original point, that's quite typical for some people with borderline. They're just explosive relationships. They can be quite very challenging in their behaviour. Yeah.
Is there something in the DSM called intermittent explosive disorder?
I don't think it's in the DSM as far as I know, no. But it is a contentious psychiatric diagnosis in that some people don't really think it exists.
Do you think that the DSM it's ever expanding to incorporate more labelling and medication to an extent?
Yeah. I think
pharmaceutical industries.
Yeah. So I use the ICD-10 more often than DSM because generally it's used more in the UK. But I know a bit about DSM. I think the problem isn't the way that things are categorized. I think it's the way that it's used. So as a psychiatrist, I'll be the first to admit that all psychiatric constructs are man-made. They're all made up. Yeah. It's not like you've got a broken bone and you can take an x-ray and you can say this bone is broken. All psychiatric diagnoses are a group and clusters of symptoms that you put together or that somebody puts together, and we all agree that you use these to categorize things. So I think that if you expand it and you get more symptoms, the problem is that you are pathologizing human experiences, but it's what you do with them. So if you're over-diagnosing and you're treating patients unnecessarily, then I think that's absolutely wrong. And that should be strayed away from. But if you're just using it as terminology to explain a mental illness, then I don't think there's anything particularly wrong with that. So to put it another way, you shouldn't just treat somebody because they match a list in a book. You should treat somebody because their mental illness is impacting on their lives and they can't manage without therapy or medication. So to me, if you do that, then it's kind of irrelevant which category of the ICD-10 or DSM that you're doing. And if you treat the patient holistically, that's more important.
It just seems like it's gone to an extreme in America.
Yeah.
All right, so we were going down the list of categories that commit the most violent crimes. We've got psychopaths, antisocial, borderline. What's next?
I think most of the patients that I've seen would fit into those categories. I suppose another one that we've not talked about is mania. So
mania.
Yeah, so bipolar affective. Yeah, exactly. So bipolar affective disorder, as you may know, is a constant flux between one of three states. So sufferers are either depressed, euthymic, which means they're in normal mood, or manic, which is mania. So it's kind of the opposite of depressed. So you're full of energy, got a flight of ideas, constantly thinking of other ideas, don't feel tired, don't feel you need to sleep, constantly eating, constantly on the go. So that is definitely associated with offending. So if somebody's in a manic state, they can be completely disinhibited and they don't really know what they're doing.
Have you got any cases you could tell us about mania?
Yeah, one that jumps to my mind would be a man who was actually on the ward at the same time as the young man that I was telling you about with borderline. So he was in his 50s, I believe, and he's like an ex-rocker, really sort of big, burly man, full of tattoos, leather jackets. Used to drink with the Kinks, apparently. That's what he told us. And he was actually a very sad case because he never really got better. And I felt a degree of guilt actually, because I was his consultant for 2 years and I plied him with medication. It never got him better. But his index offence, so his offence that got him into forensic services in the first place, was that he'd been on a 3 or 4 day binge, just drinking loads. I think he was manic. That's why he didn't feel the need to stop. He wasn't, as far as I know, using any stimulants. It's quite hard to drink for 3 or 4 days straight. I'm sure you can do it with other things in your system, but not with just booze. And he just went to a random bar quite near where he grew up, so he knows the community, knows the barman, and he asked for a drink and the barman refused to serve him because he was just in a state. So he wrestled the barman, got behind the bar and started just chucking bottles of spirits just at people that were walking by and across the bar, trashed this bar. Then the police came to try and arrest him. And I think he even knew some of the policemen because it was actually quite a small community. And he started throwing bottles at the police cars as well.
Oh, no.
So he got arrested, went to prison, then went to a psychiatric unit, which is when I was in charge of his care. And he was just a handful. And the weird thing about this man was that he had good and bad days. And on good days, he was actually very charming, really funny. He was still a bit manic, still a bit disinhibited. He called me Mowgli. That was his name for me, which is slightly racist, but it's also quite funny. And on a good day, he would dance with the nurses and he'd sing and sort of be quite a pleasure to be around. But on a bad day, he was really angry, really irritable. He was completely fixed on me because he, not completely untruthfully, believed that I was, making his health worse with these medications, because I was plying him with meds because I wanted to get him better so he could leave hospital. And so on some days he would like make a beeline for me, run towards me. He never actually put his hands on me, but he would quite frequently like run up to my face and scream at me. I remember there's about 1 week in the summer where he knew what time I'd come to work and he would wait by the window. And every time I was walking from the front security gates to my office, he would just like swear and shout at me, which is really embarrassing because all the staff can hear. And usually with somebody like that, you put them in seclusion if they're acutely really dangerous, and when they're a bit better, you stop their leave and you use leave or you use discharge as like a carrot for them to aim. So that's how you convince people to engage in therapy and take meds. But this guy didn't ever want to leave hospital. Well, first of all, he's too unwell to ever leave. But secondly, I think deep down, even though he never admitted this to me, I think he knew that he would not cope in the outside world, because you can't live if that's your behavior. You can't function, as well as being a danger to other people. You say the wrong thing to the wrong person, you're going to get, thumped. So he didn't care about leave. He didn't care about being discharged. So he was just really difficult to treat. I never really made any headway with him. Yeah, one of my regrets from my career.
One of my favourite documentaries, and it's very harrowing, but it's gripping, is about the extreme behaviour of mental illness. I don't know if you've seen it, but it's where 2 women run out into the motorway.
Yes, yeah.
What's it called? Madness in the Fast Lane?
I can't remember what it's called. That does sound familiar though, yeah.
I've watched it a few times.
Yeah. They had folie à deux, didn't they? So
they're getting run over by trucks.
Yeah.
And they jump up with superhuman strength, and anyone else would have been dead.
Yeah.
So what is it? Puff of Madness?
Yeah.
Folie à deux.
So folie, I think they had...
Have you seen that one, James? Madness in the Fast Lane. What did you think of that? Have you seen it, Joe? They're literally like these Scandinavian women. The police are called and they run out into the motorway and like into trucks and stuff.
Yeah.
And they're like down. The police come and they jump up like with superhuman strength and attack the police and run off.
Yeah.
And that's just the beginning. That's just the beginning of what happens. It gets crazier and crazier all the way through it.
So am I right? It's been a while since I've heard about this case, but am I right in thinking, Sean, that one of the women was very seriously injured, and the second one, they were twins, right?
Yeah, something. Yeah, twins.
And the second one wasn't that badly injured, but she kind of charmed the policeman into releasing her. Yeah. And then she stabbed a
was it a murder someone?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's fascinating. But there's all different. At the end of that program, I think they had interviewed different doctors and stuff and different theories. So what you said was one of them, the Puff of Madness.
No, so mine is folie à deux. It's not quite the same. It's so Puff of Madness is a different thing that's also got another potentially French name, but I can't remember what it is.
Right.
Folie à deux is madness shared by 2.
Madness shared by 2. Could you explain how the hell that happens then?
I can even give you a case example for this one, actually.
Oh, good.
So I made a video about this on my YouTube channel recently. So it is extremely rare. I've only ever seen one of these cases in my career, and most psychiatrists wouldn't see this. Mm-hmm. But it's when a psychosis, usually a delusion, is shared between two people. And when it does happen, it tends to be people who are very close, like, sisters in this case, or father and son in the case that I'll tell you about shortly. And they're quite isolated, and they tend to be withdrawn from the rest of society. So they just kind of feed into each other's bizarre delusions until they're both mentally ill. So the case that I saw was fascinating. So it was about this man, this quite sort of tubby, middle-aged, maybe 40s, early 40s man. And he was just pretty crazy. So he'd had some sort of surgery on his turbinates. So he had some breathing problems.
Surgery on his what?
On his turbinates, on the inside layers of his nose.
I've never even heard that word
So,
before. Turbinates.
Turbinates. Yeah,
That's a layer of your nose, is it?
Yeah. Well, it's like this bony layer of the inside of your nose.
Okay.
Yeah. So he had some breathing problems, and it's not that big a physical illness. People get it treated all the time. It's not like particularly life-threatening or anything.
Does it lead to snoring?
I think if you've got problems with it, that's one of the reasons I think that you can have surgery on your turbinates is because you can't stop snoring. Yeah. Anyway, so he had this operation, and he was convinced that his symptoms remained, and he was convinced that doctors in general had this conspiracy against him. So he basically started this campaign of hate over many, many years. And he started printing out, he would go to these doctor's appointments, and he would use his phone to covertly record doctors. And they'd make like clips about them, put them out on YouTube. He'd make like little posters and leaflets about these doctors and start handing them out on the streets, including to where the doctors lived. So he'd go and like post these things. Yeah. So he was kind of, I don't think he physically hurt anybody, but he was clearly, like intentionally intimidating and threatening people. So when I saw him was again for a one-off assessment, and his dad basically shared his beliefs. So they had in their mind, they'd created, I think it was called the British Unicorn Party. And there's a website. So I checked out the website. It doesn't exist anymore, by the way. I've recently Googled it. And they would believe that they were a political party that were against the criminal justice system, against doctors and against judges. And their manifestos were things like, all psychiatrists should be sectioned. Anybody who kills a judge should not have to go to prison. Should just get community service. All of this stuff. Jesus. So the reason that it really stands out in my mind was when I went to assess them, the solicitor phones me up on the way to the assessment to warn me that he's a bit of a handful. And that almost never really happens. The solicitor, I barely speak to them. They send me instructions through email.
Were you assessing both?
No, I was there just to assess the son. I didn't even know the dad was going to be there until I got there. And then right off the bat, they were really passively aggressive. They didn't, physically touch me or anything, but the dad kept calling me a psychobabblist, and like while I was talking, he would talk over me, and he was just like, "This is all bullshit. This is all psychobabble. You don't exist. Psychiatrists don't exist." So I was like, "Okay, I just need to just answer my questions so I can write this fucking court report and bounce." And then he read the son read out this manifesto with all those bizarre beliefs that I was telling you about, and he basically said, because he knew I was seeing him for a court report. And he said, if you write a court report that puts me in prison, or if the judge, and he named the judge, if she puts me in prison, then I'm going to start a campaign against you guys as well. And I'm going to make pictures and posters about you, and I'm going to distribute all of this stuff. And if you put me behind bars, then I've got this army of people, which frankly, I don't think existed. I think it was just like his dad in front of a PC. And the other thing I remember is his dad was wearing fingerless gloves. I don't know why, but that just really stuck with me.
So what ended up happening to them? So
it's hard to take anybody seriously when they've got fingerless gloves. So I was actually really worried. Like it was ridiculous, and a part of me found it quite amusing. But a part of me was also like, I've seen what they've done to these other doctors for years. I do not want that in my life. So I phoned up the judge, and that's the only time I've ever done that in my career. And I said, look, I'm really worried. This is what they've said they're going to do to me and to you. It's not up to me, but you might want to think about remanding the son, and you might want, as opposed to bail, or you might want to think about, some sort of criminal charge against the father who's also making these threats. But the judge was a bit more level-headed. So in the end, she made these really clear bail conditions that he had to sign, that if anybody contacts me or her, either them or an associate of them in any way, then he's immediately going to jail. And it must have worked because I didn't hear from him again. But wow. I was definitely checking my posts for the next couple of months.
And what's that condition called again?
Folie à deux. So I think he had a delusional disorder, which is similar to schizophrenia, but you only have delusions and you don't have all the cognitive stuff that I was talking about before. Yeah. So you can actually function quite high, you can hold down a job, but you have one particular delusional system. So I think the son had that. And I think the father got folie à deux, like just basically absorbed his delusions and thought the same things.
So the two feed off each other then?
Yeah. It's usually one person has it first and then somebody else kind of...
it spreads?
Yeah.
Can it spread to like third and fourth person?
I'm sure it's theoretically possible. I've certainly not seen it. Although you could argue, I've not researched this enough because it's never really occurred to me, but you could argue maybe that some cults might have that because you have people that have clearly delusional beliefs and that spreads.
So puff of madness then, what does that mean?
So puff of madness is like an instant, it's like the psychiatric equivalent of spontaneous human combustion, I guess. So it's when somebody suddenly out of nowhere becomes psychotic for a very short period of time and then gets out of psychosis
with
really
no
quickly.
history.
With no history, yeah. I've not seen that in my career, but I've heard about it and that documentary you're talking about. So I think they're only psychotic for days, whereas usually it takes months and months to build up, and it takes months and months to assuage as well.
Any other esoteric classifications of mental illness that we haven't touched on?
Yes, so there is Capgras syndrome.
What?
Capgras syndrome.
Capgras? Is that two words?
No, it's one word. CAPGRAS.
Capgras syndrome. Go on, what's that?
So that is a specific delusion. It's a delusion of misidentification. That is where you genuinely believe that somebody that's close to you is not actually them. So say if you believe that your, I don't know, sister, for example, wasn't actually your sister, but was an imposter. And it's like quite a fixed delusional belief. I don't think I've seen it in my career, but I've certainly heard of cases of people attacking family members and killing family members because they're convinced that it's not actually really that person. It's somebody else that looks exactly like them, but it's like a clone.
There was a case in America of a dad, a postal worker, who was driving along and his two sons were in the back and he thought one of his sons was a demon and cut his son's head off.
Right.
But that would be classified as crystal meth psychosis, would it?
Well, if he was taking crystal meth, then
yes, that's
absolutely.
not a mental illness. If you're under the effect of drugs, it's not a mental illness.
So basically,
do you have situations where they combine?
Yeah. So basically, you can have there's drug-induced psychosis, which is where somebody with no known psychosis takes drugs and then all of a sudden becomes psychotic for a very short period of time. Then the drugs go out of the system and then they're back to normal. I've got an interesting case about that if you'd like to hear about it. I'll come back to that. And there's some people who have a psychotic illness like schizophrenia, then they take drugs and that rockets them into a state of psychosis. But it tends to last longer than the 2 or 3 days when the drugs are in your system. And then you've got very occasional cases where you've got somebody with no mental health, no mental illness history who becomes psychotic on drugs and then stays psychotic. So they flip into schizophrenia. And you can't really know for sure whether they would have eventually got schizophrenia or not. You don't really know.
It's like something snaps in the mind, isn't it? Because, you know, a lot of my friends did a variety of drugs and some of them did, after a very short period of time on crystal meth, had delusions.
Yeah.
Which they still had years later when they were off the drugs. They still believed those things and the personality kind of shifted into a more paranoid.
And did they believe them to the same kind of intensity? So was their behavior reflecting?
Well, because they weren't actually on drugs, their behavior was more normal.
Yeah.
But they were set on that delusion that had formed.
Do you mind giving me an example, please?
Yeah, so I had a friend who's deceased now who...
His Wildman?
No, not Wildman. But it was Wildman and him who got on crystal meth together. And then my friend was a stockbroker. He ended up picking a computer up and throwing it at our boss. And he got fired that day. And then... he lived in one of my properties and he showed up at my property with like a wand and he was going over the television with the wand and going over all the light fixtures with the wand. And he was saying that the house was definitely bugged and I was being followed and we were all going to end up in jail.
Yeah.
This was 5 years before we did all end up in jail. So he was correct on that part of it. But the police
he wasn't psychotic, he was a soothsayer.
The police weren't onto us yet because I read all the police records. They weren't at my house, bugging the house. So I woke up. He stayed the night at my property. I woke up. There was a bucket of water. His pager, because it was all pages back then, that's how we communicated, was in the bucket of water with a note. You know, you're all going to get arrested. You're getting followed. You're getting bugged. I'm out of here. And I later learned he'd fled the state with this paranoia. And he did avoid getting arrested through these delusions. But whenever I spoke to him in later years, you know, he was still of the mindset that they were onto us at that point in time when they weren't.
And was that after all the criminal charges had been dealt with, after the prison time and everything?
So he behaved in that way at my house in about 96, 97 when I was still a stockbroker. But my criminality was starting.
Yeah.
And then I rekindled with him after my arrest. Started to write to him and stuff, and spoke to him after I got released. And but I've met a few people like that they've what's happened to them.
Yeah.
There was another one who came over with my friend Hammy, who's Wildman's cousin. And I said to them, just help yourself to the drugs in the house. And I didn't warn them, because in England, you take a gram of speed, don't you, and you eat it. So they were eating grams of crystal meth.
Right.
And when I got home, their eyes were like popping out of their heads, and they'd drunk like dozens of beers as well. And I went to bed, and I woke up, and they were having the exact same conversation when I woke up. And they were a bit stressed out. So I was like, let's go to LA. You know, I know some women out there. We could chill out. We'll go to the beach. And in the car to LA, I noticed like they're like this all the way. Like, and then they're like, Sean, you need to pull over. There's people following us.
Yeah.
People following us. Anyway, this is a long story. It's in my book Party Time if you want to read it in the new edition. The paranoid, how it built up in intensity where many things happened. And it culminated in us in this little pink hotel room on Sunset Boulevard. I'd get the same room as them because I want to keep my own on, but then they're like, you've set us up for a drug deal, that's why we're out, we're all in the same room. So I got my own room. Ended up getting a call from Hammy, you need to come down here, he's freaking out. He's looking out the windows, he said there's helicopters coming. I've set them up for a drug deal. He grabs all his luggage, throws his luggage at me because his fingerprints is on it, opens his wallet, grabs his cash, throws all of his money at me because his fingerprints are on it. I'm setting up for a drug deal. Runs off down Sunset Boulevard like a wolf on acid, a wolf on acid. He's like, and days later, he wakes up on a bench with all of his clothes pilfered by the homeless people. He's just got his trousers on, and gets a cab to the British Embassy. And apparently, during his psychosis, a Japanese family of tourists had asked him to take pictures of them. No. He knew that they were following him and bugging him there was a bug in the camera. He said, yes, got the camera, smashed the camera on the floor and ran off. But I'm told to this day, he believes I flew him out there to set him up for a drug deal. Okay. So I've got multiple friends, associates and people from my life experience have gone. Yeah. They've took crystal meth for a very short period of time and something's gone in the brain. Yeah. But I've seen other people who've took it for a long period of time, and they've been fine after when they've got off it.
Yeah, there's not something that I've experienced that often in terms of the patients that I've seen. Yeah. I do wonder whether it's crystal meth actually, because obviously you don't use that. It's not used as much in the UK compared to America. Yeah. So I wonder if there's something about that as opposed to crack, for example.
Yeah. So before I sidetrack, then what was the case you were going to give us?
I just want to say you've got some interesting friends.
Oh my goodness!
Who needs enemies?
I should have brought you a copy of Party Time with all that in it.
So the case that I saw of
Capgras is where we on?
Capgras. No. So Capgras is delusional misidentification.
Oh, we did that one. Yeah.
Yeah, but you're asking me about drug-induced psychosis.
That's it. Yeah.
So a few years ago, I assessed a gay man from South Africa, and he had just been kicked out of his grandparents' house at Christmas time. So he's walking around Soho looking for sex, basically. And he met a random man on the street, went back to this man's flat for sex, and they did this drug called a booty bump. You heard of a booty bump?
No, I've not heard of that. What is it? A booty bump?
A booty bump, yeah.
E-booty bump?
No, just booty bump.
Booty bump?
Booty bump, yeah.
Has anyone heard of that one? Booty bump?
I don't think it's a drug. It's just a method of taking drugs, I should say.
Oh, okay.
So
booty
what
bump.
You do is
like a butt rocket.
I'll
let you explain.
I've not heard the term.
Don't know anything about the butt rockets.
But, it does sound like it could be called a butt rocket. Yeah. If I had to think of a name for it, probably the butt rocket. So what you do is you mix. I think you mix either crystal meth or crack in water, and then you shoot it up your bum.
Okay.
And it goes through your sort of
gets absorbed
membranes.
by that.
Yeah. So he did one of these, and he'd used drugs sort of on and off for most of his life, but he'd never done this before. and basically became completely psychotic in this man's house immediately.
So that was, did you say that was speed and crack?
It was crystal meth and crack that he'd used,
yeah.
But I Googled it afterwards because I didn't know what he was talking about at the time. I didn't want to ask.
Yeah.
And I was like, no thanks, doesn't sound like it's for me. And he started seeing and hearing dragons in this man's flat.
Dragons?
Yeah, he started seeing and hearing dragons. So he started freaking out. And then this man, who'd only just met less than an hour before, kicked him out of his flat.
Yeah.
And then he goes round to another man's flat who's a drug dealer, his drug dealer probably, is in this man's flat, and he starts freaking out, locks himself in the toilet, takes off all his clothes, and then he texts his cousin, because she lives nearby, saying this, I'm freaking out here that the police are going to raid this flat, there's dragons all around me, you need to help, come and get me. So he texted the address, and then his cousin went to go and collect him, because she was obviously quite alarmed. And he was so psychotic that he forgot that he texted her. So when she shows up out of the blue, he was convinced that she was somehow part of this conspiracy. It doesn't sound too much unlike the state that your friends were in that hotel. Yeah. So she was convinced that he was convinced that she was part of some sort of police sting, because otherwise, how would she know that he was there? Yeah. He was naked in the bath in this stranger's flat. And she bent down to pick up some clothes, and he had a pair of scissors on him that she didn't see. And he stabbed his own cousin on the top of her head, and then he stabbed himself through the cheek. Oh. So the injury to the cousin wasn't actually that bad. It was only there was only a little bit of blood, just some glued, but he needed 12 stitches on his cheek. Yeah. And the fascinating aspect of this is that he was fine. Days later, he had to go to A&E, and drugs were flushed out of his system. But when I saw him, he was just completely normal. Apart from this massive scar in his face.
Did the cousin press charges then?
Yeah, she did. Yeah.
And what sentence did this person get?
So he actually got away with a relatively minor sentence. Actually, on the back of my evidence, it was a community order, because it was his first serious offence. I think he'd done some shoplifting as a kid. Yeah. But basically, his solicitors again wanted me to push for a charge of not guilty by reason of insanity, because he was clearly psychotic and he's clearly fearing for his life. But crucially, because it's voluntary intoxication, you can't get a defence of not guilty by reason of insanity if it's voluntary intoxication, because otherwise
you take responsibility for getting intoxicated.
Exactly. Yeah. So he didn't get that defence, which means he would have been innocent in the eyes of the law, but he got off with a community.
I'll just give you one more part of the story that I just told about the guy who threw the luggage, because it just came to me then, which is one of the craziest things I've ever seen in my life. So prior to him throwing his luggage and his money at us, we're trying to calm him down, me and Hammy. And then Hammy says, I need to take a piss. And the guy goes, why do you need to take a piss? Who are you going to go and signal to? And Hammy's like, I'm not going to go and signal to anyone. I've been drinking all these years. I need to go and take a piss. The guy goes, well, I'm coming with you then. Yeah. He goes, what do you mean I'm coming with you? You're not going in there and signaling to someone. Yeah. Saying you're taking a piss and signaling to someone without me. Yeah. I'm coming with you. He's like, well, I've really got to take a piss, for fuck's sake. If you want to come with me, come with me. The guy jumped on his back like a monkey like this. And Hammy's like, fucking hell, I've really got to take a piss. So Hammy goes, right, and with this guy on his back to take a piss. He's having a piss. The piss finishes. And I'm just mystified, Yeah. And all I hear is, why did you shake your dick 3 times at the end of the piss? Who are you signaling to? But this is this ghetto pink hotel room with frosted windows in this dodgy neighborhood. And then these gutter punks walk past the windows. And the guy's like, I knew it! And the gutter punks are looking, I knew you were signaling to someone outside of this window. And that then just set him over the edge. And that's what led to, within a short period of time, the money getting thrown at me and the luggage getting thrown at me. Yeah, I
think I can maybe top that. This is not a page that I've ever seen, but just a story that I heard, which is, the Wu-Tang Clan rap group. Yeah. So one of their affiliate members, it's not one of the core Wu, but one of their, they have these Wu-Tang Killer Bees. One of their affiliate rappers cut his own dick off when he was.
No. No.
Yeah.
Oh. Yeah. Run it down. What led to it? What happened? What was he after? Did he get a new dick?
Did he get a new dick? Yeah, he went to the dick store.
Bob it.
So I've only seen a YouTube video about this months ago, but from memory, he basically had a drug-induced psychosis. So he went to some sort of party. I think he was drinking lean and possibly smoking I imagine crystal meth, and basically became really, really psychotic. Had these thoughts about how he shouldn't father any more children because he's not a man enough to look after his own kids or something like that. And yeah, cut off. I don't think he cut the whole thing off, but cut off a section of his dick. Yeah.
Oh, a section.
Yeah.
Oh, we got to get to the bottom of this. What actually happened? Was his dick? Was it? Did he lose that section permanently? Was it? Can he function now?
So I think you'll have to do your own research, but I think he had some sort
People
of
can
operation.
be googling the hell out of this right now watching this.
I think he had some sort of operation. So I think he.
What's his name?
I don't know. I'm sure you could Google it. But I know he's a Woo affiliate.
Because people were so fascinated by the Lorraine Bobbitt story, weren't they? Because of a similar.
Yeah.
And that guy ended up. Didn't he get an implant or something? Did it get sewn back on eventually?
So I think Lorraine Bobbitt was it John Wayne Bobbitt? Is that right?
Yeah.
I think his dick, did get sewn back on.
Because it
But I don't
was,
think
she
it was ever the
threw it,
same.
didn't she?
Yeah,
and they
yeah,
went and
avocado
looked
window,
for it.
yeah.
And they found it and put it in a freeze box or something. And did he get it? Was it successfully reattached?
I think it was, yeah.
But then he became a porn star and got a dick enlargement or something.
Yeah.
Something like that happened. This is a fascinating case. I think it's on Netflix or YouTube. But I remember because I was in America when it happened.
Yeah.
And just
What state was it?
Pardon?
What state was it in America that it
I
happened?
can't remember. I think it was in the 90s though.
It was
when it
near
happened.
where you were.
I can't remember. There's so many states. But it was just such alarming news, that.
Yeah.
And then all the women were like, the women who had supported battered women were like rallying, saying it's about time some guy got his dick cut off, because he was abusive towards. And I think there was he did have a history of that, and I think in future relationships as well, alcoholism and bad situations with women.
Yeah.
So maybe he had it coming. I don't know.
Yeah. It's quite a unique way to get into the porn industry, isn't it?
Yeah. But I think he ended up trashing. His life ended up pretty depressed and in alcohol and stuff. From the documentary I watched recently, it wasn't very glamorous what happened to him in the end.
Yeah.
Yeah. So don't go cutting anyone's dicks off. And
as a doctor, I second that.
All right then. So, are there any really cases that you've not told us today that are in your book that perhaps we could go over that would be interesting for people to hear?
I'm trying to think.
Oh my goodness, you've not talked about any cases of paedophilia.
Actually, yeah, I could
Go on then.
I
What
can tell
happened
you a little
there?
bit about that. So, actually, I've done in my career, I've had, I think, 3 separate cases of men who were vulnerable for one way or another. So I think a couple of them had learning disabilities and one of them had autism. And all 3 of them were completely separate cases, different timeframes, but very sort of quite similar in many ways. So all of them been targeted by these vigilante online groups. I think one was an official group that was run by the police, and the other 2 were just these groups that random people set up, and they try and sort of catfish men. And so what they do
Catfish men are going after kids.
yeah, exactly. Yeah. So what they do is they set up these fake accounts of being young females, sort of usually 14 or 15 years old, and they flirt with these men, and the men kind of then arrange to meet them somewhere. And then, so of the cases from memory, one was they arranged to meet them in a service station. Another one was just in a random pub, but it's actually a group of blokes who kind of detain them, probably rough them up a little bit, and then call the police, and the police get arrested. So I've seen 3 of these cases, and I think a couple of them, it was clear to me that they were predators. And although I have to be very careful in the evidence I give, I never say whether I think somebody's guilty or not, because first of all, it's unethical because I shouldn't really try and influence the jury, but also my evidence can be thrown out. So if I write really good detailed court report, put in all that time and effort, but then I make a comment about whether I think they're guilty or not, then the opposition barrister can criticize my evidence and the entire report can be thrown out. So I literally can't. But so I think for 2 of the cases, I felt that clearly they were predators and they were clearly going there for sex. And there was they had these really lame excuses. I think one said that, one of them, as well as this, so one of them said that his phone had been nicked by his mate, and his mate was sending these Facebook messages as a joke It's not really very plausible. And another one had also had some indecent images found on his hard drive. And I think he tried to convince the police that he'd bought the hard drive, bought the laptop secondhand from somebody else, and he didn't know the images were there. Again, not very plausible. But I have to say that one of the cases made me feel a bit uneasy because the man had autism, and I think that he was quite sort of lonely and withdrawn. I think he'd never had like a relationship. He was talking to what he thought was a boy who, I think the boy said he was 15, who was a gamer. So they started talking through like the love of whatever online games that kids play nowadays. And from what I read from the messages, this vigilante group were really trying to pull this man in. And so they started the sexual chat and they kept it going, and they really tried to draw him in. And he said on several occasions, like, I don't think this is appropriate, and I just want to be friends, and blah, blah, blah. And basically got talked into meeting this boy. Now, there's different ways to look at it. You could say that he still actually turned up. So potentially he is a sexual offender, and that is true. I don't think you can deny that. But I felt a bit uncomfortable about it as well, because I felt that I think he was criminally culpable. I think he knew what he was doing, and I think he knew it was wrong. In fact, the very fact that he tried to dissuade the meeting from happening in the first place indicates that he knew what's wrong. So you can't argue that he's got, a psychiatric defense, because he knew what he was doing clearly. But at the same time, I also think that there are extrinsic factors. So the fact that he's got autism and that he struggles with finding relationships, that he has problems finding intimacy and understanding people's emotions. So I remember feeling quite uncomfortable about the whole thing. I felt like he was kind of, potentially a criminal, but also potentially vulnerable. Because you can be two things. You can be somebody that does bad things, and you can actually have mental health issues and be vulnerable.
So there was a degree of entrapment as well, do you think?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So what about when forensic psychiatrists make mistakes? Are there any alarming situations where people get released and go on to do heinous things?
Yeah. So just suddenly thought of another case, actually, I'll tell you about after this. So there, with any psychiatrist's career, a non-forensic psychiatrist, the worst, or one of the worst things that can happen to you is that a patient commits suicide. So I've got a story about that, which I'll come to. And that is almost inevitable statistically. I don't think it happens to every psychiatrist, but for the average psychiatrist, even a good psychiatrist, that's going to happen once or twice in your career, because it's just a numbers game. If you treat hundreds, maybe 1,000 patients over your entire career, and they've all got suicide, not all, but some of them have suicidal tendencies, then even with your best treatment, even if you think they're going to be safe, some of them, or a small number, are going to go on to commit suicide. It happens. With forensic psychiatry, you've got suicidality amongst your patient cohort, but you've also got the potential for violence. So as we were talking about before, you have to discharge patients eventually. You have to, because the system gets clogged up. If you never discharge anybody, then number one, what's the point in having them in a hospital? You might as well put them in prison. And number two, it doesn't free up the space for the other new patients to come in. So all you've got is what's in front of you. You have to risk assess, as I said before, on their behavior, on their boundaries, whether they use their leave appropriately, whether they engage in psychotherapy, whether they take the medication. So that does happen. So every that I'm aware of, at least 3 or 4 times a year, you'll hear a case in the newspapers where a patient has been discharged either recently or within the last few months, and they've gone on to commit serious offences, including murder. I can tell you about a case if you're
yes,
interested.
Please do. Yeah.
Let me just check my notes about the name. So in 2004, there was a man called John Barrett, who is quite well known within the forensic psychiatric system, in that he'd got a recurring mental illness. So he'd committed various violent offences, had been sectioned, rehabilitated, released, and he'd go through the cycle. And what happened was that he was admitted in 2004, and he was given leave by a psychiatrist who had not seen him. I think he'd only got there that day, or maybe the day before. And he was sort of really pressurizing the nurses to give him leave, and he was being a bit of a handful, was being quite aggressive. And so she made what I think is fair to say an incorrect decision, because she thought she knew him because she'd seen him so many times in the past. She didn't think he was that dangerous. She let him go on leave, and then the very next day he'd randomly stabbed and killed a banker who was riding past on their bike. This is somewhere in London. Yeah, so I mean, that arguably is is avoidable because you shouldn't be giving somebody leave, obviously, if you've not properly assessed them. What's interesting about that is the entire way that you're allowed to give leave has actually been changed because of that. So now you have to write these formal forms that get signed off by a consultant that says, that you've assessed the patient, et cetera, et cetera. But in a broader sense, that is a risk that I have to live with, or that forensic psychiatrists have to live with, that is statistically, I wouldn't say it's inevitable, but it's probable that one of your patients, even if you're good at what you do, will go on to commit quite serious violence because of the group and the risk of the group that we work with.
How does it feel to have that power in your hands over a person's life and the potential for that person who could get out and kill someone?
How does it feel? I don't think I've ever thought about that. I think that so when I was, what I do now is mostly court work, so it's not really that relevant now. But when I was an inpatient in a hospital, I had complete say over aspects of their lives, like leave and when they get discharged. And I always thought that you had to give everyone a chance, that you, despite what they have done, and some patients, not all, but some have done some quite horrific things. You've got people that have killed family members, you've got people that have committed sexual offences, sometimes against children. As a doctor, you have to separate yourself from that, and you have to give everyone the best chance of being reintegrating into society. So I've tried my best not to judge people for what they've done in the past. I've tried to take that out of the situation and only look at their psychiatric health now and the risks.
You wouldn't be able to function, would you, if you couldn't do that?
Absolutely. And in terms of how it feels that people might go out and reoffend, it's not really bothered me that much, because the perspective I look at it is that me and my teams, it's not just me, it's the nurses and psychologists, etc., have helped far more people reintegrate into society and live a better life than when we got them out of prison in the first place onto our wards, than the number that will go on to commit violence. So we don't stop everybody from reoffending, but I think the ones that we do stop, you're not only protecting them, but you're protecting potential future victims.
So in the Arizona jail, there was a thing called Rule 11 status, whereby you're classified as mentally ill for court proceedings. And some prisoners chose to go down that route and fake mental illness. Yeah. So I had a cellmate who was like a pocket-sized Henry VIII looking character called Troll. And he would like walk around the day room with his pink boxer shorts on with skid marks in them on purpose. Yeah. And he'd say things like, if the judge asked me to give him a BJ and he'd release me tomorrow, I'd give him a BJ, and just be going around acting all crazy with his poo on his boxers. People want to read more about Troll, that's in Hard Time on Amazon. So what do you do when people come to you faking mental illness? How do you spot it?
You know what, Sean? It's actually much easier than you think.
Is it?
Yeah, it's actually very easy.
Is it?
Yeah. So I'll tell you why. Because the first thing that I do before I see a case for a medico-legal assessment, the first thing I do is I look at their background history, get all their medical notes, get the psychiatric records. It's not impossible for somebody to become psychotic the first time they offend, just like that young woman I told you about right at the beginning. But it's very unlikely. The vast majority of people have a history of psychosis. They become psychotic slowly over time. So if they're walking around with skid stains and offering to give judges blowjobs, but I can tell from their records, from their GP records, that they've been absolutely fine. Yeah. The GP saw them about their blood pressure 2 weeks earlier, and or a month earlier, and they're absolutely fine. Yeah. Then my bullshit radar's on like high alert. So that's one thing. The other thing is that I get objective evidence from where I can about them now. So if they're in a hospital, I speak to the nurses. If they're in prison, I speak to the prison officers. If I see them in court, I speak to the custody staff. And you'd be surprised at how bad people are being consistent. So it sounds like your friend was doing this all the time, whereas most prisoners don't even think to do that. They will only do it when they've come into the room with me. He
did lose his Rule 11 status. He didn't get it granted. I think he got 15 years in the end.
And so I'll be watching them. So if they're scared and cowering in the corner about some sort of demon or bat they can see in the corner, then I'm watching them without them knowing. When they're walking back to the cells, I'm seeing if they're pally with their friends and laughing and joking. And on top of that, more than that, I think that people who are really psychotic, especially if they're paranoid, they don't have an agenda to try and convince me. So imagine if you're actually really paranoid and you believe that people are trying to hurt you and kill you, and you believe there's a conspiracy. If some guy you've never met in a suit comes and sits next to you and introduces himself, you're not going to tell him. because why would you? If anything, it would be the opposite. It's quite hard to get these symptoms out. Whereas somebody who's faking mental illness, who wants to go to hospital, they tell me almost immediately or within a few minutes, I think I'm mad, doctor, and I think I need to go to hospital and blah, blah, blah. People who are really unwell, they don't have an agenda. And sometimes they're indifferent. They don't even know that they're in prison or court. They don't care where they end up.
There's a saying that crazy people don't know they're crazy.
Yeah.
Does that apply?
Well, so for psychosis, the vast majority of people who have psychosis don't have insight. So they fully believe the things they're experiencing. Yeah. It's different for neuroses like anxiety and depression. They know that they're unwell.
So we've had a guest who's been on a few times called Pepsi Watson, and he's been in and out on a recall for his IPP. And on the most recent interview we did with him, he said lockdown, people that can't get out the cells, short-staffed, self-harm, people committed suicide. There was a hanging and someone cut his ear off. Right. So what's the rate you come across self-harmers? So I think in the general population, about 1% of people self-harm at some point in their life. In prisons, it's something along the lines of 20-25%. So it's actually very high. Yeah. Quarter. But I would say that there's a range of self-harm. So there's relatively minor sort of scratching or picking, cutting, and that can be because somebody's just trying to relieve frustration. So actually some people, for example, with depression or borderline, actually feel better after they've cut themselves because it quenches urges to be violent or to do something more serious. And then on the other end of the spectrum, you get really severe self-harm, so actual suicide attempts. So actually very recently I made a video about Sarah Reed. So that's a tragic case of a young woman. She was mixed race, only 31 years old. And she took a life in HMP Holloway in January 2016. So it's really, really quite sad. And I think the system failed her. I really do. What had led up to that? So I think she had a history of mental health issues since her own son died in 2003. Then she was really badly assaulted in 2012 by a police officer, actually. And I think it was proven in court that he actually got fired for misconduct for what he did. He assaulted her quite badly. But the reason that the system failed her, I think, is because she was kept in prison for several weeks, I think like 6-7 weeks, because she needed a fitness to plead assessment. It was actually a very simple assessment. Like I could do that in an hour and write it up in maybe another 4 or 5 hours. But she was there for 6-7 weeks. And I think part of the problem is that there's not really any responsibility for who does it. So if you're the prison psychiatrist, you're in charge of treating that person's mental illness in prison, giving them medication in prison. If you're the consultant psychiatrist in the secure ward, then you help with the transfer and you treat them when they're in there. But if you need an expert witness kind of opinion, which is what I do, you're kind of in limbo. You don't belong to anybody. It's up to your solicitors to reach out and find a psychiatrist. And some solicitors are just really disorganized and they don't do that for a number of weeks while their defendants are on remand. So I think she was there unnecessarily and she was there too long. So a very sad case. So Russell Brand has talked about low-level drug users. It should be reclassified from them being the criminalization of addiction to it being a mental health issue. Yeah. What are your thoughts on that? I would broadly agree with that, I think. I think that if you just take the ethics out of it, if you just look at it logically, your average low-level drug user who's not a dealer, who's not going out hurting people, is not causing a massive damage to society. But if you criminalize them and you put them through the system, especially if they get addicted to harder drugs, then I don't see how that's helping. And these people are clogging up the prison system and clogging up the court system. It's crazy, but there's so much money being made off it. Yeah. All right, and so we are gonna put the link in the description box for a Psych for Sore Minds. Huge thank you to Sohom for coming on today and regaling us with all of these case studies, and I've learned so much as well about I was particularly fascinated when you said about which mental illnesses are correlated with the most violent crime, and it's psychopaths, then antisocial, then the borderline, then mania, then bipolar. Yeah, so... Well, mania and bipolar are kind of the same thing. Okay. Yeah. Oh yeah, mania is... someone with bipolar can have a manic episode. Yeah, exactly. So if you sat here and enjoyed this as much as I have, please go over to A Psych for Sore Minds, which is Sohom's channel. And on Twitter, you are Dr. S. Das. So we'll put that link down there as well. And I'm looking forward to seeing your book, man, In Two Minds coming out. Congratulations on landing that with a really big publisher.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, I'm sure it's going to do well. You hear these stories and they're just endlessly fascinating, aren't they? All the different cases. So please let us know in the comments what you thought about this. Huge thank you to Joe and James for coming out today and filming these. We've had such a busy week. We've been all over the place. London, filming tours in London. Down at Castle Goring with Lady C on the royal family. It's been quite an eventful week. And huge thank you to the new subs. Subscription logos in the bottom corner. And most of all, huge thank you to Sohom for coming out today and sharing his stories.
Thank you very much for having me on, Sean.
Yeah,
It's been
you're
an
welcome.
absolute honour. Really enjoyed it. Thank you.
Yeah. You're such a good vibe. So we traditionally do a hug. Are you all right to hug?
Yeah.
Yeah. In this environment. Yeah, thanks, man. Well done. Brilliant. Yeah, cheers.